All right, well, good morning, Secretary Bellows. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those who are maybe meeting the Monitor for the first time, my name is Kate. I am the editor of the Maine Monitor. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan investigative news site based in Augusta. And this, of course, is Maine Secretary of State Shenna Bellows. And we are so excited that she was able to take the time out from her very busy schedule to talk to us today about the upcoming primaries and the general election in Maine, and just generally about the election process. So we have an hour. I'm going to dive right in because that we should.
This is what we're here for.
This is what we're here for. I was hoping you could actually just start by talking a little bit about first the process of becoming Secretary of State and how that happens. And then also just give us an idea of your role, particularly as it relates to sort of the municipalities and the town clerks in overseeing Maine's elections.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm so excited to be here. Maine's Secretary of State is a role laid out in the Maine Constitution, and contrary to the US Secretary of State, I don't get to visit other countries and do foreign policy. The Secretary of State's role in the Constitution is the guardian of the seal and the keeper of the records of the state. That means I oversee Maine State Archives, and over time, it has evolved to include overseeing the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and corporations as well. But what we're here to talk about today is the role in overseeing elections. Our elections are administered at the municipal level. A lot of folks who are new to Maine, perhaps from the West or the South, get a little bit confused about this because in New England, elections are administered at the town and city level with oversight by the state. Out West and in most other states across the country, elections are administered at the county level. And the counties are actually very independent, oftentimes from the state secretaries of state. But for us, the towns and cities run our elections. They actually implement the elections. That's where people vote. But the Secretary of State oversees the entire process as the state's chief elections official. That means we certify all the candidates, and then we design, lay out, and print all of the ballots for the entire state at every state, federal, and county level. We provide a single contract for the machine tabulators that are used, the modern day abacuses, as you were, that tabulate the ballots for every city and town. And we really oversee every step of the process. Now, the cities and towns hire their own clerks and deputy clerks and registrars to actually implement the election, but we provide the training and the oversight to make sure that the law is followed and that they have the tools they need to ensure that our elections are free, fair, and secure.
Well, so let's talk about that process. You know, I was talking to a researcher recently who said that, you know, they've been surveying Maynard and local government, and one of the things this person said was striking from their research so far has been sort of the degree to which people trust their local government, but they don't trust the voting process, even though, as you just sort of said, it is administered primarily at the local level. And she said one of the things that they're finding is that people don't really understand how voting is supervised. They don't understand who's in charge, or how their vote is actually counted, or what happens after it's cast, and how the certification process works. So what I'm hoping you can do is just walk us through this process sort of from the very beginning, maybe even like starting as far back as the actual ballot machines. Talk to us about, you know, where those come from, how they're chosen, how, you know, the process around the voter rolls and sort of how you prepare those. If you could just like start at the beginning.
Elections 101.
Yeah,
Elections
101.
And I will say, I haven't seen that particular research or talked to that researcher. I will say Mainers should be very proud. When you look at the data in terms of voter participation, we are #1 in the nation in voter participation. So in 2022, all of the states report voter participation as a percentage of voting age population to the Election Assistance Commission, which is a federal body that looks at all of the elections across the country. And we had just over 61% of our voting age population participated in the 2022 election. When you look at percentage of registered voters, that was even higher, almost as high as 75%. So not quite there, but approaching. And that's really exciting. That sends a message that certainly voters are showing up and participating. But you're right, there are myths that persist. And I think voting is one of those things that 20 years ago, people just took for granted and maybe just did and didn't really think about what are the checks and balances? How does it work? So I'd love to walk through that whole process from beginning to end.
Yeah.
So first, let's just think about ballot creation. How do the ballots come about? Well, candidates decide that they want to run. There are deadlines. They gather signatures from registered voters in their districts. They submit those to their cities and towns to make sure that the people that are saying that they want this candidate to run are in fact registered voters. So those are checked by the local clerks, and then it's submitted to my office and we check it again. So we make sure that the candidates have met those requisite thresholds for signature collection, that they're registered voters, that their petitions are proper, that the candidates themselves meet the qualifications for office, that you don't have like a 15-year-old, for example, running for the House of Representatives. And we then certify the candidates, and then we begin the process of designing the ballot. Now, Maine law is very clear on every step of the election. So for the geeks out there, it's called Title 21A, and you can literally look it up on legislature.maine.gov. It's the legislature's website. They have the whole statute there online. But so going back to the ballots, we draft the ballots, we create these draft ballots, and for the June primary on June 11th, think about it, it's going to be over 300 ballot styles because you have 151 members of the House of Representatives. And of course, you have the option for any of Maine's 5 parties to field candidates in the primaries for any of those races. And then you have 35 state senators, you have 2 House members of Congress, and every 6 years you have a Senate candidate, US Senate candidate as well. So we prepare, and then for county commissioner candidates, you have, and district attorney candidates and sheriff's candidates, you have all of those candidates all across the state. So different ballots look different in different towns, and our office is responsible for the integrity of what is on that ballot. So we design the ballots, and the ballots are designed to be read by the tabulators that we use. It's called a DS200. The company is ES&S. And we then send out, we go out to bid for printing of ballots. And we then use test ballots to check. We program the memory devices on tabulators. So we have one statewide contract. We've been using the same tabulators for about 10 years all across the state. And what happens is there's special memory devices. Now they look like USB devices, but you can't just buy a USB device at Staples and put it into the tabulator. It's a special memory device. And those get programmed with the ballot design for that municipality. Now those get programmed here at the state level by civil service, nonpartisan election staff. So I'm not involved in the programming or the ballot design for that matter. We always do those things in teams of 2, so they're eyes on the process. And then we take test ballots. We literally have election civil service staff filled out the ballots. So say you and I are running against each other, and you have test ballots for our town. It might say, they would fill it out to have Kate win, 3 on 3 ballots, and Shenna win on 2 ballots, and then run the test ballots through the tabulator once that memory device is programmed, and make sure that the count is accurate. Okay, Kate had 3, Shenna had 2. Okay, that memory device is working. The ballot is being read by the memory device appropriately. We then send out the memory devices to the towns. The ballots are also shipped out to the towns. The towns then have to test their tabulator. So their tabulator is on site in secure storage from one collection to another. They take the new memory device, they put it into their machine, and they conduct a logic and accuracy test. And so they're testing again to make sure that the test ballots are read by the machine accurately, so that when if they're using the same test, say Kate gets 3 votes, Shenna gets 2, they run that through and make sure that that is working. They're testing their machines, making sure that the machine is going to be accurate on election day. So there's logic and accuracy testing happening at the state level and happening at the town level. The towns have to let us know that they tested their tabulator, that their tabulator is working, and that it's working appropriately.
Can I just stop you?
Yeah.
And do they follow kind of the same process as your office, where there are 2 nonpartisan?
So
Civil
I'm so glad you're asking this. So there's some functions that the clerk can do, right? And then there are other functions, and so some of the, for example, the clerk is authorized to receive the ballots and just send us it will let us know ballots received in-house, because we need to know, did the ballots get from point A to point B? And you do have some clerks, remember, we have over 500 cities and towns. So you have some clerks that may be working part-time, and they may have a clerk's office that is open 1 or 2 days a week. They may have as few as 3 voters. So no, in that situation, do we need 2 people to sign for the ballots? No, the clerk is authorized to do that. Now, generally, there are steps in the process, however, where where there are required to be teams of multiple people, and also where the political parties can come and watch the process. So this isn't something that happens. These things are not something that happens behind closed doors. So ballots are shipped out and voting started this past Monday, 30 days prior to election day is when in-person absentee voting can happen, or you can request your ballot online, or you can request your ballot over the phone. Now, every person who requests a ballot has to be a registered voter in the central voter registration system. The system is a statewide system. Clerks manage their records for their towns and cities, but they can't go into other towns and cities to do any changes to voter registration records in other places in the state. And so say you request a ballot from your town. We have an online tracking system so that the town gets your request and you can make it in person, you can make it on the phone, or you can make it online. The clerk goes into the system and says, okay, Kate has requested a ballot, and marks that as an absentee ballot request. Now, twice a week, every week, we run a query in that system to query all the voters who requested all of the absentee ballots and post that information online. So anyone in the state can see, oh, Kate's asked for her online ballot, or asked for her ballot, it's not an online ballot, asked for her ballot and has requested an absentee ballot. Now
That's a public
information
website somewhere that.
Yeah, it's on our website. You can look and see all the absentee ballot requests that have been made in the state.
Okay.
And so you can, the parties use that to do what's called ballot chase. So they might reach out to you and say, hey, Kate, saw that you got the ballot, really hope that you're gonna vote for so-and-so. Or you might suddenly get a mailer in the mail that says, please vote for so-and-so. More importantly for you, you can watch, once you make that request, you can see when the clerk has issued your ballot. You can fill out your ballot at home. Voting is not a test. You can vote in the presence of the clerk. You can return that ballot through the mail or in an absentee ballot drop box or in person. But you will see when the clerk receives your ballot, and that gets recorded in the system as well. So people can watch and see, okay, there have been 1,000 ballots returned in Portland. Now there's been 2,000, now there's been 5,000, or, anywhere across the state, they can see the number of ballots that have been returned. They can see, gosh, Kate hasn't returned her ballot yet. She must be undecided. Let's send her some more mailings. But no clerk can just open those ballots by themselves in a back room alone. And this goes to your question of when are there multiple people in the process? In fact, those ballots don't get opened until a day when they're all getting processed in the public view of anyone that wants to watch that, including representatives from parties. And no ballot can be returned. Like if those ballots come with an absentee ballot request envelope that has your information on it. And you have to sign it. And you have to return it in that absentee ballot return envelope. You can't just choose a different envelope. You can't just pop the ballot in the mail by itself. In fact, a couple of years ago, we received a call from the US Postal Service. There's just this ballot here in the mail. What do we do with it? And we said, nothing. There's nothing. That ballot is not valid. Similarly, this is how people can be assured that no one's stuffing ballot drop boxes, because you can't just, if you place ballots in a drop box, they're not valid. They have to be in that absentee ballot return envelope, and it can be signed by the voter. And then those are the clerk records, okay, Kate sent back her ballot, but she doesn't open it. I'm saying she, because many of our clerks are she's. But what she does is she posts a notice to the major political parties and to the public. I will be processing absentee ballots on the Friday prior to election day or the Saturday prior to election day. And then observers at that point can send people to watch. And that is a process where there have to be multiple poll workers. And they're opening groups of ballots at the same time. They're not looking at the ballots themselves. They're setting them aside in stacks or in bins to then be fed into the tabulator. Everybody can see that all at the same time.
Can you go back to the process of sort of certifying the signatures, both for candidates and for the ballot initiatives? That's something I have always wondered about. I think of the way that I write my signature, which often differs sort of from one document to the next. And I wonder, how do you go about actually certifying signatures for either ballot initiatives or for candidates? What does that process look like?
So at the municipal level, the clerk is looking up the voter in the voter registration system. And when you register to vote, you sign the back of your voter registration card, or if you're registering to vote now online, you have to provide a signature. If you're registering to vote at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, you're providing a signature that's also on your license. So when you sign a petition, the clerk is looking at, okay, Kate has signed this petition. Is she registered to vote in this town? And some of that, and then say a petition, say the clerk sees these registered voters on a list that's been submitted on the petition, and all the signatures look strangely alike. Maybe they're all slanting toward the left, or they're all slanting toward the right. Or even maybe there are two signatures, maybe it's a husband-wife, and there are two signatures that look shockingly similar. The clerk can pull the voter registration card for the voter. They can pull the scanned copy from the system, or they can actually pull the card from their file in their office and look and see. Now, I sign my name sometimes 100 times a day or more. I oversee notaries public, for example, so I'm signing all of those certificates. Absolutely, my first signature in that stack of 100 looks a little bit different than my last signature in that stack of 100. But there are certain things that it has in common. Like, I am always going to do my S like an S. I am never going to do my S in the old-fashioned cursive way. So that's a tell, right? My signature tends to be fairly upright. People tend to have a consistent slant, whether it is whether it's one way or another, or straight up and down. Some people, they may have a scrawl that looks slightly different every time they scrawl it, but they're never doing the old-fashioned cursive signature. So those are the types of differences that we're talking about. We're not talking about taking, what kind of paper was it that you would do tracing when you were a kid? Especially if you were learning signature.
Yeah.
We're not taking like trace paper and putting the two signatures on and being like, ooh, is that loop exactly the same size as that loop? No, you're looking for the fundamentals of the signatures. And one of the reasons the parties and individuals can be present and looking at the absentee ballot processing is not only to make sure, oh, okay, nobody's putting a ballot in a pocket or putting it aside not to be counted, but they can actually examine the envelopes. They can look at all the envelopes and see, do those look like legit signatures? Are these legit voters? And see that. And again, when we talk about some of the myths around, about potential voter fraud, the law is actually so clear in terms of the checks and balances about how it happens. So for example, say you think, oh, perhaps people are going to try to swing the election in Manchester, Maine, my hometown. Well, how are they going to do it? Maybe they're going to vote fraudulently. Well, they can't get ballots unless they're a registered voter and they make a valid ballot request. Well, maybe the clerk isn't paying attention to the ballot request, or maybe they're going to forge a ballot and they're going to make something that looks like a ballot. Well, the clerk can't accept the ballot and put that it's been accepted into the system unless it matches a ballot request. So maybe if something looks like a ballot and it's come in the mail and it's come in an envelope, that clerk cannot accept it unless there has been a valid request. So there are different checks and balances like that that are kind of common sense.
Yeah. I want to talk about the new online voter registration system, which
Okay.
you guys mentioned, but first, we had a question from somebody, a reader. We saw in Michigan in 2020 how the local officials can sometimes refuse to certify election results. Is that something you are worried about in Maine at all?
No, and I do think, one of the strengths of our democracy and one of the challenges in terms of voter understanding of how it works is that every state is different. So in Michigan, the counties actually certify the election at that local level. In Maine, we're what's called a top-down state. So the towns are reporting their results. And they're not just reporting the results of the ballots, they're reporting also who participated. So remember, when you go to vote on election day, you don't just get handed a ballot. You have to go and you have to state your name and your address, and they're marking you on the voter rolls. They're making a notation that you have requested a ballot, and then you're being issued that ballot. And so all of those ballot requests, whether they happen as absentee ballot requests or whether they happen on election day, every request, every person who votes has to be entered into the central voter registration system. So on election night, when those ballots are counted by the tabulators, the warden, who's the person in charge of a polling place in Maine on election day, has to sign off on those counts. They have to post those counts in public. Now, those counts are watched by anyone. Candidates will often send representatives to watch the tabulation in a particular town. When I was a state senator for 11 towns in Kennebec County, I would always send volunteers to watch the count, just to make sure that the machine was working properly and that it aligned with what our expectations were, that it didn't raise any questions for us. And usually my opponents would have people there too. So they post the count publicly. They will often report the count to the media if the media asks. And then they have 2 business days. So there's an election night warden's tally, the tally of the votes. And then the clerk is going in and they're doing a clerk's tally of the votes. And they're reporting that to us. And they're also submitting the warden's tally. So the clerk and the warden have to agree on what the tally was. And if there's a discrepancy there, then that flags for us that there are questions. Similarly, the clerks have to enter every voter who participated. So then we can also look and see, okay, this number of voters participated in this town, and that matches the number of ballots that were reported out. So that's just another check and balance on the system.
Well, so let's talk about the online voter registration system, but
Sure.
actually, before we do that, can you just briefly review some of the upcoming deadlines for people to
Yes.
register or switch parties? Just-
So voting is happening right now.
Yeah.
Request your absentee ballot today. And of course, you can register to vote at any time. So if you're not registered to vote, you can register to vote and request your ballot on the same day, or you can register to vote and vote on the same day. That's called same day voter registration. We're very proud of it. However, say you're in one political party and you've changed your mind. You want to participate in the other party's primary. Maine law allows you to register to vote for the first time or update your registration if you've just moved, up to including on election day. But Maine law prohibits party hopping for the purposes of manipulating the outcomes of a primary. So what that means is if you want to change parties to participate in the opposite party's primary, you must do so at least 15 days prior to election day. So this year, that happens to fall on Memorial Day. And guess what? The towns are not open on Memorial Day. So you really need to do it the week before. So, and that goes for all political parties. We have 5 political parties in Maine. We have the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Green Independent Party, the Libertarian Party, and the No Labels Party. Not all political parties chose to have a primary because they didn't field candidates in every single race in the state. So if you were a member of the No Labels Party, which didn't field any candidates in the June primary, you cannot choose instead to vote on the Democratic Party ticket or the Republican Party ticket, because we have what's called a semi-open primary that allows unenrolled voters, voters who are in no party at all, they can choose. But once you've chosen a party, you're restricted to voting in that party. And you can't change your mind on election day, you have to do it in advance.
So that would be, I think it's next Friday, right, May 24th.
That's right.
If people want to switch parties, they need to do it before.
They should do it this week.
Yeah, there you go.
But
Yeah.
so if you want to do online voter registration, that deadline is even earlier. So remember, online voter registration, it isn't the online system that is registering you. It isn't me, the Secretary of State, that is registering you, or the state. It is simply a mechanism to receive that voter registration more efficiently for the voter. The clerk still has to verify your identity and your residency. So whether you register to vote in person or in the old-fashioned way, when you have green cards that you can find in different places, maybe at a town fair or something, you're mailing it in, or somebody else is mailing it in for you. Regardless of how you register to vote, the clerk has to do the same things. They need to make sure that you've demonstrated identity. So, sometimes people say we don't have voter ID. We don't require that you show a specific form of ID on election day, but we do require that you show proof of identity to register. And the clerk has to make sure that the clerk agrees that you have done so to the satisfaction of the clerk. The second thing is you have to show proof of residency. The clerk has to believe that you in fact live in that clerk's jurisdiction. And that can be done in a variety of ways, but regardless of, even if you're doing this online, you're providing that proof of identity, you're providing that proof of residency. Now that can be the Maine driver license, because if you have a Maine driver license, you've showed your identity and your residency to the satisfaction of your own vehicles. But the clerk still has to look at all of that, make sure that they agree, that they concur with that information. And then they have to send out something called a voter registration acknowledgement notice. Now, this in some ways is a little old-fashioned. It's a federal requirement. It's a paper letter from the clerk to the person who's newly registered or newly changed their registration that states, I've accepted your voter registration, you've shown me your proof of identity, you've shown me your proof of residency, or I've rejected your voter registration. So for example, and this is a big fear that people have, is, sometimes I've been asked, like, what if Russia gets into our online voter registration and just floods it with fake people? Well, we have a lot of security checks on the system, so we would see that that was happening and shut it down pretty quickly. But B, the clerks in the towns have to individually verify each voter. So if suddenly, Talmadge, Maine gets 100 registrants in a single day, well, they're going to know that that's not accurate, and they're not going to process those individuals without proof of identity and proof of residency that they live in the jurisdiction. So all of that takes a while, and so that's 21 days prior to we will take the online system down under the law 21 days prior to election day, so that the clerks can properly certify the identity and residency of the voters and send those voter registration acknowledgement notices to confirm for the voters that they're either good or not good. Now, of course, if they're rejected, you can take your identity and your residency, and you can go to the clerk's office and get that fixed, or you can go on election day.
Do you have a sense of what percentage of registrations are rejected each
I
year?
think it's very high, but no, we don't keep that data.
Now, we have a fairly new election security law that went into effect in 2022. Can you talk to us a little bit about that law, what it's designed to prevent, and whether anybody has been prosecuted under it?
So unfortunately, one of the things that we've seen that's a new trend is threats of violence against election officials. And this is something, I was talking to a clerk a couple of years ago, and I never forgot this conversation, because she said, when she first started out in her career, and she's been doing this for over 2 decades, she said election day was like homecoming. People would bring pies, they would bring cookies, it was big, lots of hugs, like very, very appreciative. And unfortunately, the benefits of people being really interested in the elections process is, I think that's good for civics education. I think it's good for people to understand how voting works and what the checks and balances are. The concerns are when people believe lies about elections, when they believe that the voting process is not secure or that the results are not accurate, then they tend to blame or punish the person that they hold most responsible. And that is usually your local elections clerk, who is just trying to make elections work for everybody in their town. And so what we saw in 2021 was really unprecedented. We saw a couple of very serious threats against election clerks in Maine. And the clerks requested, and we agreed and went to the legislature for passage of this new law, some protections to make it explicitly a criminal offense to threaten an election official, and give the Office of the Attorney General the power to do the investigations and the prosecutions in those circumstances. But also, the legislature asked us to receive threat reports from the clerks and issue an annual report to the legislature on the nature and extent of the problem. And the good news is the law seems to be working. We had an incident in 2022 where a man was very threatening. He really upset the local election workers. We were able to contact law enforcement. He got what's called a knock and talk. They stopped by, said, hey, here's the law. You can't do this. And it was the best possible outcome. He was extraordinarily apologetic, and made it really clear to the local election officials that he was sorry, that he did not intend to instill fear in any way, that he really understood that he was having a bad day. So we have not yet had to move forward to prosecution, thankfully, and I'm really glad for that. Under that law, we have been publishing annual reports to the legislature, and we have been doing threat assessment and reporting training for our clerks on an annual basis, as well as regular de-escalation training. And the de-escalation training is really valuable because lots of people have bad days. Now, that does not excuse inappropriate language or threatening behaviors, but I think making sure clerks have tools that they can use to bring down the temperature when a customer or a voter is being really confrontational or really angry. And we continue to do election security preparations across the state. We have worked with our federal partners at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency to do physical security site assessments of polling places and clerks' offices at the clerk's requests in certain jurisdictions. And we continue to do annual training, both in physical security, de-escalation, as I mentioned, threat reporting, and also in cybersecurity. So we've really been working with folks to improve their cybersecurity knowledge and protect themselves against potential breaches of our systems in that way. So I really appreciate how responsive the legislature was. It was a bipartisan bill. It was a bipartisan vote. It was really people coming together from all sides to say threats against our election officials are unacceptable because that undermines the fabric of democracy itself. And, you know, I always encourage people that have questions. We are a very open state. If you don't know how elections work and you want to know how elections work, you should be a poll worker. Maine state law requires poll workers from both major political parties. We have to have roughly equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats in every polling place across the state on election day. So it's a great opportunity to see how the process works. Now, we always remind people, you can't both be a poll worker and a poll watcher. There is a role for observers, and certainly the political parties will, or candidates, or nonpartisan organizations like League of Women Voters will send poll observers just to monitor how elections are going and identify problems and report those problems up to my office so we can take action as appropriate. But it is a great opportunity to see how the process works. And it is so interesting to me. I definitely have had people work as a poll worker and then, you know, suddenly understand, oh, it's a lot of work. Our local clerks are working really hard. And B, we have made our systems very secure. It is very hard to cheat our systems. And there are checks and balances so that if people do vote twice or they do vote improperly, there are checks and balances to catch them and to prosecute them, as we did with a couple of cases in 2020.
Do we have enough poll workers for the upcoming elections, and what happens if you don't have that equal balance?
So we're always looking for more poll workers for every jurisdiction so we can have backups, right? I visit polling places on election day and I travel all across the state, and what I have found some jurisdictions will do is they'll just extend the shifts. So, you know, I'll meet a poll worker and they'll be like, yes, I've been here since 5 o'clock in the morning. And it's like, oh, thank you. And I'm so sorry. And, you know, in this work, you know, that means that somebody said that they would, and then something came up. Maybe they got sick, maybe they had a conflict suddenly arise with work or life. And the poll worker who did show up is now doing a double shift or a triple shift. So that is, you know, our clerks always make it work. Sometimes they're recruiting people on their staffs, you know, so maybe, you know, sometimes I'll show up at a polling place and I just am so appreciative, and it's, you know, the guy that does the roads for the town is also there as a poll worker, or, you know, various people in the town from recs and parks, you know, parks and rec to, you know, whatever it might be, or it's all hands on deck to work there in the polling places. The law does permit if there's an emergency situation. So say, you know, you have your, say you had, the clerk had set it up so there were equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats, losses in major political parties, and then someone backs out. If it's an emergency situation, they can recruit someone to fill that gap, because we can't, the most important thing is that there be multiple people in that room working on those tasks. So when you go to get your ballot, it's not one person getting your ballot. It's two people, one person asks your name, the other person is giving you that ballot.
Let's actually, can we go back to the voter ID for briefly?
Sure.
So, you know, I know, right, we don't have to show our IDs at the polls to vote in Maine, but as you said, we do have to show it to actually register. And as I know, you know, there have been various efforts over the years to require voter IDs at the polls. I believe there's one, you know, ongoing now. Do you think that would enhance security to require voter IDs at the polls?
I do not. And I think the debate is really not about whether you require identity for voting. Every state in the country requires proof of identity for purposes of voting. The question is where in the process and how. So in Maine, that proof of identity is required at the point of registration. And stating affirmatively your name and address when you arrive on election day is also affirming your identity in that moment. And that easily creates a situation so that if someone comes to vote and someone has already voted in their name, that alerts people to the fact that a problem exists. And I'm always very skeptical of the people who are like, oh, I heard that happened in the last election. Did it? Like, then why didn't the person tell their clerk and the Secretary of State's office in the moment? If you showed up and Kate had already voted, wouldn't you tell the clerk? Wouldn't you call the Secretary of State's office? Wouldn't you write a story on it on election day? There's more attention on elections on election day than any other day of the year. So I'm always a little skeptical of people saying, oh, that happens all the time. No, like, we get calls on election day about people wearing controversial t-shirts at the polls. So I really, I think that that is one of those myths that won't go away, but I think unfortunately it's an example of misinformation in the modern era that sometimes goes viral and is not actually rooted in fact. So when it does happen, and it's not that, you know, clerks never make a mistake, most often it's a William Jr. and a William Sr. and dad comes in and says, and they say, oh, you're sure you've already voted? And he says, no, I didn't. And they're like, oh, wait a second, is it possible that it was your son? And then they check and they verify, oh my goodness, we're really sorry, we checked off William Jr. instead of William Sr. So that's, you know, that type of thing has happened in the past, and usually there is an explanation, and usually it is immediately resolved because, again, common sense tells you that if you go to vote and someone has voted in your name, you're going to know and you're going to say something and take action to get it fixed.
You know, I've lived in small towns in Maine for a long time now, but I grew up in Portland. But the last time I waited in line to vote was probably when I lived in Portland. Can you talk to us about some of the laws around soliciting people in line? I mean, do we have laws like exist in some other states where, you know, you can't give water, or what does that look like in Maine?
So we do have laws restricting political activity at the polling place in Maine. So for example, at the March primary, candidates who were not on the presidential primary ballot, so people running for the legislature, had that ability to gather signatures or gather clean elections contributions at the polling places, but only after people have voted. So only as people are going out the door. And sometimes you'll see people gathering petitions. That's the most common thing that you see, is people gathering signatures for a citizens initiative. And in fact, probably, you know, back to the voter ID, it's very likely that people will see signature gathering at the polling place for that initiative, as well as for another initiative that's been approved. And that's up to the campaigns and the clerks, assuming there's space, but it has to be at the exit, cannot be at an entrance. At the entrance, there is no political activity permitted. People are not, you know, candidates will often stand and they can say, you know, hi, I'm Shenna, thank you for voting today, but they cannot actually, what's the right word? They can't politic, they can't campaign. And when they do, people should complain to the warden. And, you know, sometimes people will call our office and say, we think this person is politicking, they're wearing a big shirt, or there's a sign here in the parking lot. We can take action to make that not happen.
Okay. Just gonna take a look at some questions that
And
we've
ours,
got here. So we have a couple of kind of interesting things going on right now with respect to our electoral votes. The first is that, you know, we have this fairly unique system in which we do split our electoral college votes by congressional district, which to my knowledge, Nebraska is the only other state that does that.
Right. Yeah.
At least for now. I think there's a movement afoot to change that. And then we also recently joined the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, in which we'll award our electoral votes to the candidate who received the most popular votes in all 50 states and DC, provided they reach a certain threshold. Can you just talk a little bit about, you know, how and why this sort of unique electoral system came about in Maine. And would it change permanently if the interstate, the popular interstate vote compact goes into effect?
So, yes, first and foremost, and breaking news, the people's veto that I referred to is about the national popular vote compact and whether Maine should stay with the electoral college or move into this agreement among the states to determine electoral assignments based on the national popular vote. So that's the people's veto that people may see at the polls on election day, in addition to the citizen initiative for voter ID that I mentioned. So the electoral college dates back to the concept of representation. So sometimes people don't realize, maybe because they weren't paying attention in civics that day, or their school didn't offer civics, that we don't have direct popular vote for president. So when you're voting for president in every state in the country right now, it's not a direct vote. It is a vote for electoral college votes. And every state in the union has electors in the electoral college proportional to their representation. So Maine has 4 electoral college votes. Now the candidates and parties choose their electors who will participate in the actual electoral college on their candidates' behalf. So in 2020, for example, you know, people went and they voted, and in their minds, they were voting for Biden and Trump. They were voting for electors who then met as an electoral college here at the state capitol in Maine, and there were 4 of them. And interestingly, because we have votes assigned based on congressional district and statewide, one of those electoral college votes was for Mr. Donald Trump, because congressional district 2, the vote across that district, Trump won. And 3 of those electoral college votes were for President Biden, because in CD1, President Biden received the most votes, and then at the state level did as well. So the 4 of us, and I say us because I ran for the electoral college that year. I was like, what is this electoral college? How does it work? And I was really curious about that. And I ran on behalf of Joe Biden. And so I was one of the 4 people, and I was literally sitting next to the gentleman who was casting his vote for Donald Trump. And it was our votes that were cast that then are sent securely to the National Archives and delivered to Congress on January 6th. And then Congress records the electoral college votes for the whole country. So I think sometimes that blows students' minds, right? Like, you think that you're voting for president, but you're voting for the electors who are then voting for president. Now, the National Popular Vote Compact is an initiative, it's an agreement among certain states that would say that instead of allocating those presidential electors, those 4 votes, based on who wins in Maine, it would be based on who wins the national popular vote across the whole country, so who wins nationwide. If enough states agree, that's where it's called a compact or an agreement, that if they all did it that way, that the winner of the national popular vote would then become president in the electoral college. So I know that's slightly confusing. Happy to try to explain it again, but it is interesting. It's really, and that question, so the legislature passed the law and said, we do think that whoever gets the most votes nationwide should win. Folks that advocate for that believe more in this idea of direct democracy. They don't believe it should be 4 people in Maine. It should be all of the people in Maine and the whole country. That law passed, it's in effect, but the people's veto puts that law on hold so that the voters, if those folks seeking to do a people's veto get enough signatures, the voters will have an opportunity to weigh in.
Can you know, we did see in some states that there were, I think the official term is faithless electors, you know, people who pledged to vote for one person, but then voted for somebody else. is that something that you worry about in Maine? What happens in Maine if we have a case where that happens?
It's not something that I worry about, and also Congress has strengthened the Electoral Count Act, and there were alternative elector slates in 2020. People were actually sending fake elector slates or trying to send them to Washington, and some of those people have been prosecuted. So it's not something that I'm particularly worried about. There's a Luke Bryant song, most people are good. And I think when it comes to our elections and our structures and our processes, campaigns can be awfully ugly. People can say nasty things on the campaign trail. Sometimes, no two people are ever going to agree on 100% of everything. Not even my husband agrees with me on everything. But most people are good, and I have confidence in our systems and in the rule of law. And I always encourage people, if you don't understand the system, you don't understand the law, get involved, volunteer. Democracy means that it is truly, the goal is that it's open to everyone.
So we have about 7 minutes. I think my last question, what do you see as sort of the greatest threat to elections in Maine and nationwide, and how is your office working to mitigate that?
I'll tell you what I told a high school student yesterday who was interviewing me for a civics project. I think the greatest threat to our democracy, to paraphrase Franklin Delano Roosevelt, former president, is fear itself. I think that sometimes anxieties and fears can lead people to make poor decisions, whether it's threatening a local election official or turning away from participating or turning away from understanding because they're too fearful or it's too hard. And so certainly we're, making physical security preparations, really strengthening our cybersecurity to protect the central voter registration system. But we have the gold standard in election security. It's a paper ballot. And we have really good people working all across the state, clerks in every city and town to make our elections run. We have the nation's longest serving election director in the country, Deputy Secretary Julie Flynn. She served under Republican secretary, under many Democratic secretaries. So the people are good, the laws are strong, and the fundamentals of the paper ballot are there. And I've talked to secretaries all across the country, Republicans and Democrats. And you know what? Most states are using paper ballots. Most states have the same checks and balances that I've described, or similar checks and balances. I think our elections are more accessible, more people participated in 2020 than ever before, and more secure. So despite concerns about voter suppression, despite the ugliness of our campaigns sometimes, despite some of the attacks on the rule of law itself, fundamentals are strong. It really requires us to have courage and faith and participate.
I know I said last question, but well, this is the question I ask at the end of all my interviews. What didn't I ask you that you would like people to know?
Oh, well, the June primary is June 11th. And so you definitely, and people are like, well, why participate in the primary? And that's because primaries are often determinative of the outcome in November. So who wins the primary races will be the candidates on the ballot in November. And some people are like, oh, well, I really only care about president and the presidential primaries in March, and we know who's going to be on the ballot in November. Fair. But honestly, talking to students, I said, do you know that the legislature determines the speed limit on the roads, plus the budget for your schools, plus the environmental laws in our state, and so on and so forth. So I really encourage people, take the time to turn out in June, because voting in these state races, voting in the congressional races, that matters.
All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you to everybody who tuned in. We will have this conversation up on our website shortly, so you can watch it later if you didn't catch it today. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.